Anastasia, The Ringing Cedars, Book 1. I exist for those for whom I exist. Anastasia. Anastasia herself has stated that this book, written about her, consists of words and phrases in combinations which have a beneficial effect on the reader. This has been attested by the letters received to date from thousands of readers all over the world. If you wish to gain as full an appreciation as possible of the ideas, thoughts, and images set forth here, as well as experience the benefits that come with this appreciation, we recommend you find a quiet place for your reading where there is the least possible interference from artificial noises, motor traffic, radio, TV, etc. Natural sounds, on the other hand, the singing of birds, for example, or the patter of rain, the rustle of leaves on nearby trees, may be a welcome accompaniment to the reading process. Ringing Cedars Press is an independent publisher dedicated to making Vladimir Megra's books available in the beautiful English translation by John Woodsworth. We rely on word of mouth as our only advertisement and thank all our readers for help in spreading the message. Order online, ringingcedars.com. Translator's Preface. When I opened my online Slavic languages bulletin one day in early September 2004 and first learnt about a book in the Ringing Cedars series that was seeking a translator into English, little did I realize the kind of literary adventure that was waiting for me. But as I became acquainted with the details of Vladimir Megra's fascinating work, I read through the first 3 books in the series before beginning the actual translation. It gradually dawned on me that much of my previous translation experience, especially in poetry, from Pushkin and Anna Akhmatova to modern bards, and poetic prose, as with the stories of contemporary Russian writer Mikhail Sadovsky, not to mention my own religious background, emphasizing man's unique status as the image and likeness of the Creator, had been preparing me specifically for this particular task. Megra's work was simply the next logical step, it seemed, in the progression of my career. Indeed, I found myself taking to it, not only with enthusiasm that comes with the prospect of facing a new professional challenge, but even more with the thought of feeling very much at home in this new literary environment. Some of my friends and colleagues have asked, "What kind of book are you translating?" No doubt wondering whether they could look forward to reading a novel, a documentary account, an inspirational exegesis on the meaning of life, or even a volume of poetry. But even after completing the translation of Anastasia, I still do not have a definitive answer to give them. In fact, I am still asking myself the same question. My initial response was a rather crude summary of a gut impression. I would tell them, think Star Trek meets the Bible. My feelings about the book, however, go far beyond this primitive attempt at jocularity. Of the 4 disparate genres mentioned above, I would say that Anastasia has elements of all 4, and then some. First, the book reads like a novel. That is to say, it tells a first-person story in a most entertaining way, bringing out the multifaceted character of both the author and the title personage in a manner not unlike what readers of novels might expect. It tells the tale of adventure in the raw Siberian wilds, where even sex and violence make an occasional appearance, though with a connection to the plot line quite unlike their counterparts in any work of fiction I have read. Secondly, the book gives the impression of a documentary account of real-life events, even if one's powers of belief are sometimes stretched to the limit. I am glad that my linguistic experience has given me access not only to the book itself, but also to a host of Russian language texts on the internet that have enabled me to corroborate from independent sources a great many of the specifics the author saw fit to include in his narrative. Names of individuals, institutions, scientific phenomena, etc., all of which turned out to be genuine, thereby contributing an additional measure of credence to what otherwise might seem utterly fantastic. Much of the corroborative information so gleaned I have attempted to pass on the English-speaking reader in the footnotes, and with the help of additional commentary by the publisher. And yet there is a significant area of the author's description where authenticity must still be judged by the individual reader, which to me is one of the hallmarks of a work of literature, in contrast to a merely academic or journalistic report. Thirdly, the book penetrates one's thinking and feeling with the gentle force of a divinely inspired treatise. A treatise not only on the meaning of human life, but much more. Anastasia offers a tremendous new insight into the whole interrelationship of God, man, nature, and the universe. I would even go so far as to call it a revelation in science and religion. One nutshell description that comes to my mind is a chronicle of ideas. Ideas on A, the history of humanity's relationship to everything outside itself. B, the clouds, not only dark and foreboding, but even the fluffy and attractive variety of mistaken belief that have, over the years, hid this relationship from our sight and comprehension. And C, where to begin, once we have caught sight of this relationship, the necessary journey to reclaiming the whole picture. Deeply metaphysical in essence, the chronicle is set forth with both the supporting evidence of a documentary account and the entertainment capacity of a novel. In other words, it can be read as any of these three in isolation. But only by taking the three dimensions together will the reader have something approaching a complete picture of the book. And all three are infused with a degree of soul-felt inspiration that can only be expressed in poetry. Yes, indeed, one must not overlook the poetry. As a matter of fact, I learned right at the start that experience in poetic translation was one of the qualifications required of a Ringing Cedars series translator. And not just on account of the 7 sample poems by readers at the end of chapter 30. Much of the book's prose, especially when Anastasia is speaking, exudes a poetic feel, with rhyme and meter running a background chorus through whole paragraphs at a time. Hence, a particular challenge lay in reproducing this poetic quality, along with the semantic meaning, in English translation. Such poetic prose is even more evident in subsequent books in the series. Another challenge has been to match, as closely as possible, Vladimir Megra's progressive development as a writer. According to his own admission, Megra began his whole literary project not as a professional writer, but as a hardened entrepreneur for whom writing was the farthest activity from his mind. I smiled when one of the test readers of the translation, after finishing the first few chapters, described the author's style as choppy. Megra himself talks about his initial rejection notices he received from publisher after publisher, telling him his language was too stilted. And yet, rendering some of Anastasia's pronouncements toward the end of book 1 waxes quite lyrical indeed, especially in the poetic passages referred to above. The author's development of literary style, which he attributes to Anastasia's direct and indirect guidance, becomes even more pronounced as the series progresses. It will be up to the English-speaking reader to judge whether the transformation is also conveyed in the translation. There were 2 Russian words of frequent occurrence throughout the book that presented a particular translation challenge. One of them was dachniks, plural of dachnik, referring to people who own a dacha, or a country cottage, situated on just about 600 square meters of land, obtainable free of charge from the Russian government. But there is little comparison here to most Western concepts of cottagers. While Russian dachas may be found in forested areas or simply upon farmland, one almost invariably features a plot on which is grown fruits and vegetables to supply the family not only for their dacha stays, but right through the year. Given the word dacha is already known in many English speakers and is included in Oxford and Webster editions, it was decided to use the Russian word designating its occupants as well, with the English plural ending dachniks. The question that entailed the most serious difficulty, however, was that formed on the subject of several dozen emails between publisher and translator before it was finally resolved. That was the rendering of English the Russian word chelovek. It is the common term used to denote a person or human being, the equivalent of German Mensch, as well as English man in the familiar Bible verse, God created man in his own image. The problem with the term human, as in human being, is that it not only suggests a formation of the species from matter or earth, compare humus, the organic constituent of soil, but is also associated with lowly concepts. From humus comes words like humble, humility, etc., whereas chelovek is derived from the old Russian words indicating thinking, cello, and time, vek, i.e. an expression of man's dominion over time by virtue of his God-bestowed capacity for rethinking and reasoning, not unlike the significance of man in the Bible verse cited above. The problem with the word man is that, especially in our age, it has come to be closely associated with only half of the total number of sentient thinking beings on the planet, that the other half, quite understandably, feels excluded collectively by the term. Russian, by contrast, does not have this problem. Chelovek can designate either a man or a woman. In the end, partly through reason and partly through revelation, it was decided to translate chelovek, wherever appropriate to the context, by the term man with a capital M, in an effort to retain the association of the term with a divine as opposed to material earthly origin, as well as to show the link between Anastasia's view of man, chelovek, and the concept of man in the first chapter of Genesis, which she freely quotes herself. So let all readers of this book be put on notice. Wherever you see man with a capital M, this includes you. There are other discrepancies between Russian and English concepts behind respective translation equivalents, but their explanation is best left to individual footnotes. In conclusion, I must express my gratitude to my editor, Leonid Sharashkin of Ringing Cedars Press, first for entrusting me with the privileged task of translating such a monumental work as this Ringing Cedar series. And secondly, for the tremendous support he has given me through the initial project, namely in illuminating aspects of Megra's and Anastasia's concepts of God, man, nature, and the universe that my previous experience with Russian literature could not have possibly prepared me for. These shared insights have made a significant difference in how particular nuances of the original are rendered in the translation, and especially in making allowances for the considerable geographical, social, and philosophical distances that are all too often separate English-speaking readers from the vast cultural treasures accessible to those with a knowledge of Russian. I now invite you to take your seats in the familiar exploration vehicle known as the English language as we journey together to examine a previously inaccessible Russian treasure of momentous significance for all of humanity, including the planet that we collectively inhabit. An experience summed up in one beautiful word: Anastasia. By John Woodsworth, Ottawa, Canada, 2005. January. Anastasia. In the spring of 1994, I chartered 3 riverboats on which I carried a 3-month expedition on the River Ob in Siberia, from Novosibirsk to Salikard and back. The aim of the expedition was to foster economic ties with the regions of the Russian far north. The expedition went under the name of the Merchant Convoy. The largest of the 3 riverboats was a passenger ship named the Patrice Lumumba. Western Siberian riverboats bear rather interesting names. The lead ship, Patrice Lumumba, housed the expedition headquarters along with the store where local Siberian entrepreneurs could exhibit their wares. The plan was for the convoy to travel 3,500 kilometers, visiting not only major ports of call such as Tomsk and all these others, but smaller places as well, where goods could be unloaded only during a brief summer navigation season. The convoy would dock at a populated settlement during the daytime. We would offer the wares we had brought for sale and hold talks about setting up regular economic links. Our traveling was usually done at night. If weather conditions If weather conditions were unfavorable for navigation, the lead ship would put into the nearest port, and we would organize on-board parties for the local young people. Most places offered little in the way of entertainment. Clubs and community centers, so-called houses of culture, had been going downhill ever since the collapse of the USSR, and there were almost no cultural activities available. Sometimes we might go 24 hours or more without seeing a single populated place, even the tiniest village. From the river, the only transportation artery for many kilometers around, the only thing visible to the eye was the taija itself. I was not yet aware at the time that somewhere amidst the uninhabited vastness of the forest along the riverbank, a surprise meeting was awaiting me, one that was to change my whole life. One day on our way back to Novosibirsk, I arranged to dock the lead ship at a small village, one with only a few houses at best, some 30 or 40 kilometers distant from the larger population centers. I planned a 3-hour stopover so the crew could have shore leave and the local residents could buy some of our goods and foodstuffs, and we could cheaply pick up from them fish and wild-growing plants of the taija. During our stopover time, as the leader of the expedition, I was approached by 2 of the local senior citizens, as I judged at the time. One of them appeared to be somewhat older than the other. The elder of the 2, a wizened fellow with a long gray beard, kept silent the whole time, leaving his younger companion to do the talking. This fellow tried to persuade me to lend him 50 of my crew, which numbered no more than 65 total, to go with them into the taija, about 25 kilometers or so from the dock where the ship was berthed. They would be taken into the depths of the taija to cut down a tree he described as a ringing cedar. Footnotes: Taija is the Russian name given to the boreal forest that stretches across much of Siberia and northern Canada. The word Siberia is derived from an Old Tungus word, sivir, meaning land, world, or tribe. Cedar, in this case and throughout the book, referring to either the Siberian pine or Siberian cedar or to the Lebanese cedar. So it's actually a pine tree, even though they call it a cedar. Which he said reached 40 meters in height. This Siberian cedar needed to be cut into pieces which could be carried by hand to the ship. We must, he said, definitely take the whole lot. The old fellow further recommended that each piece be cut up into smaller pieces, and each of us should keep one for himself and give the rest to relatives, friends, and anyone who wished to accept a piece as a gift. He said this was a most unusual cedar. The piece should be worn on one's chest as a pendant. Hang it around your neck while standing barefoot in the grass, and then press it to your chest with the palm of your left hand. It only takes a moment to feel the pleasing warmth emanating from the piece of cedar, followed by a light tingling sensation running through the whole body. From time to time, whenever desired, the side of the pendant facing away from the body should be rubbed with one's fingers, thumbs pressed against the other side. The old fellow confidently assured me that within 3 months the possessor of one of these ringing cedar pendants will feel significant improvement in his sense of well-being and will be cured of many diseases. Even AIDS? I asked, and briefly explained what I had learned about the disease from the press. The oldster confidently replied, "From any and all diseases." But this, he considered, was an easy task. The main benefit was that anyone having one of these pendants would become kinder, more successful, and more talented. I did know a little bit about the healing properties of the cedar of our Siberian taija, but the suggestion that it could affect one's feelings and abilities, well, that seemed to me beyond the bounds of probability. The thought came to me that maybe these old men wanted money from me for this unusual cedar, as they themselves called it. And I began explaining that out in the big wide world, women were used to wearing jewelry made of gold and silver and wouldn't pay a dime for some scrap of wood. And so I wasn't going to lay out any money for things like that. So 40 meters is the height of the tree gets, and that's about 131 feet. "They don't know what they're wearing," came the reply. "Gold, well, that's dust in comparison with one piece of this cedar. But we don't need any money for it. We can give you some dried mushrooms in addition, but there's nothing we need from you." Not wanting to start an argument, and out of respect for their age, I said, "Well, maybe someone will wear some of your cedar pendants. They certainly would if a top wood-carving craftsman agreed to put his hand to it and create something of amazing beauty." To which the old fellow replied, "Yes, you could carve it, but it would be better to polish it by rubbing. It would be a whole lot better if you do this yourself, with your fingers, whenever your heart desires. Then the cedar will also have a beautiful look to it." Then the younger of the two quickly unbuttoned his older worn jacket, and then his shirt, and then revealed what he was wearing on his chest. I looked and saw a puffed-out circle or oval. It was multicolored, purple, raspberry, auburn, forming some kind of puzzling designs. The vein lines on the wood looked like little streams. I am not a connoisseur of objets d'art, although from time to time I have had occasion to visit picture galleries. The world's great masters had not called forth any particular emotions in me, but the object hanging around this man's neck aroused significantly greater feelings and emotions than any of my visits to the Tretyakoff Gallery. "How many years have you been rubbing that piece of cedar?" I asked. 93, the old fellow responded. "And how old are you?" 119. At the time, I didn't believe him. He looked like a man of 75. Either he hadn't noticed my doubts, or if he had, he paid no attention to them. In somewhat excited tones, he started trying to persuade me that any piece of this cedar, polished by human fingers alone, would also look beautiful in just 3 years. Then it would start looking even better and better, especially when worn by a woman. The body of its wearer would give off a pleasant and beneficial aroma, quite unlike anything artificially produced by man. Indeed, a very pleasant fragrance was emanating from both these old men. I could feel it, even though I'm a smoker, and like all smokers, have a dulled sense of smell. And then there was one other peculiarity. I suddenly became aware of phrases in the speech of these strangers that were not common to the residents of this isolated part of the North. Some of them I remember to this day, even the intonations associated with them. Here is what the old fellow told me. God created the cedar to store cosmic energy. When someone is in a state of love, they emit a radiant energy, but it takes a second for it to reflect all the celestial bodies floating overhead and come back to Earth and give life to everything that breathes. The sun is one of those celestial bodies, and it reflects but a tiny fraction of such radiance. Only bright rays can travel into space from man on the Earth, and only beneficial rays can be reflected back from space to the Earth. Under the influence of malicious feelings, man can only emit dark rays. These dark rays cannot rise, but must fall into the depths of the Earth. Bouncing off its core, they return to the surface in the form of volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, wars, etc. The culminating achievement of these dark rays is in their direct effect on the man originating them, invariably exacerbating the man's own malicious feelings. Cedars live to be 550 years old. Day and night, their millions of needles catch and store the entire spectrum of bright energy. During the period of the cedar's life, all the celestial bodies pass above them, reflecting this bright energy. Footnote: trees indeed capture a wide range of radiation beyond visible light. Man-made antennas are but an imitation of branching pattern in trees. Both the structure of trees and the materials composing them betray natural wave receptors. Tree sap is a great conductor of electricity, which is why a tree hit by lightning virtually explodes. Even in one tiny piece of cedar, I'm not done with the footnote. Static electricity was first received from amber, which is fossilized resin from conifer trees. For details, please see Philip Callahan's books, including Tuning into Nature and Ancient Mysteries, Modern Visions, The Magnetic Life of Agriculture. Victor Schauberger referred to trees as bioelectric condensers. Siberiac is the next footnote, which means a resident of Siberia. The old man continued, even in one tiny piece of cedar, there is more energy beneficial to man than in all the man-made energy installations taken together. Cedars receive the energy emanating from man through space, store it up, and at the right moment give it back. They give it back when there is not enough of it in space, in other words, in man, or in everything living and growing on the earth. Occasionally, though, very rarely, one discovers cedars that have been storing up energy but not giving back what they have stored. After 500 years of their life, they start to ring. This is how they talk to us, through their quiet, ringing sound. This is how they signal to people to take them and saw them up and make use of their stored up energy on the earth. This is what the cedars are asking with their ringing sound. They keep asking for 3 whole years. If they don't have contact with living human beings, then in 3 years, deprived of the opportunity to give back what they have received and stored from space, they lose their ability to give it directly back to man. Then they will start burning up the energy internally. This torturous process of burning and dying lasts 27 years. Not long ago, we discovered a cedar like this. We determined that it had been ringing for 2 years already. It was ringing very softly. Perhaps it is trying to draw out its request over a longer period of time, but still it has only 1 year left. It must be sawed up and given away to people. The old man spoke at length, and for some reason I heard him out. The voice of this strange old Siberiac sounded at first quietly confident and then very excited. And when he got excited, he would rub the piece of cedar with his fingertips as though he were lightly tripping over some kind of musical instrument. It was cold on the riverbank. An autumn wind was blowing across the river. Gusts of wind ruffled the hair on the old men's capless heads, but the spokesman's jacket and shirt remained unbuttoned. His fingertips kept rubbing the cedar pendant on his chest, still exposed to the wind. He was still trying to explain its significance to me. Lydia Petrovna, an employee of my firm, came down the gangplank to tell me that everyone else was already on board and waiting for me to finish the conversation. I bade farewell to the oldsters and quickly climbed aboard. I couldn't act on their request, for 2 reasons. Delaying departure, especially for 3 days, would mean a significant financial loss. And besides, everything these old fellows said seemed to me at the time to be in the realm of pure superstition. The next morning, during our usual company meeting, I suddenly noticed Lydia Petrovna was fingering a cedar pendant of her own. Later, she would tell me that after I had gone aboard and stayed behind for a while, she noticed that when I started scurrying away from the old men, the oldster that had been talking to me stared after me with a perplexed look and then said excitedly to his older companion, "Now, how can that be? Why didn't they get it? I really don't know how to speak their language. I couldn't make them believe. I simply couldn't. Why? Tell me, father." The elder man put his hand on the son's shoulder and replied, "You weren't convincing enough, son. They didn't grasp it." As I was going up the gangplank, Lydia said, "The old man that was talking with you suddenly rushed up to me, grabbed me by the arm, and led me back down to the grass below. He hurriedly pulled out of his pocket a string and attached to it this piece of cedar wood. He put it around my neck and pressed it against my chest with the palm of both his hand and mine. I even felt a shiver go through my whole body. Somehow he managed to do all this very quickly, and I didn't even get a chance to say anything to him. Amidst the flurry of my subsequent commercial dealings, accounting, keeping, and end-of-voyage farewell banquets, I completely forgot about the strange Siberian oldsters. Upon my return to Novosibirsk, I was afflicted with sharp pains. The diagnosis, a duodenal intestinal ulcer and osteochondrosis of the thoracic spine. In the quiet of the comfy hospital ward, I was cut off from the bustle of everyday life. My deluxe private room gave me an opportunity to calmly reflect on my 4-month expedition and to draw up a business plan for the future. But it seemed as though my memory relegated just about everything that had happened to the background, and for some reason, the old men and what they said came to the forefront of my thought. I requested to have delivered to me in the hospital all sorts of literature on cedars. After comparing what I read with what I had heard, I became more and more amazed and began to actually believe what the oldsters had said. There was at least some kind of truth in their words, or maybe the whole thing was true. In books on folk medicine, there is a lot said about the cedar as a healing remedy. They say that everything from the tips of the needles to the bark is endowed with highly effective healing properties. The Siberian cedar wood has a beautiful appearance and artistic woodcarving masters enjoy great success in using it for furniture as well as soundboards for musical instruments. Cedar needles are highly capable of decontaminating the surrounding air. Cedar wood has a distinctive, pleasant, balsam fragrance. The small cedar chip placed inside a house will keep moths away. In the popular science literature I read, it said that the qualitative characteristics for northern cedars were significantly higher than for those growing in the south. Back in 1792, the academician P.S. Pallas wrote that the fruits of the Siberian cedar were effective in restoring youth and virility and significantly increasing the body's ability to withstand a number of diseases. Footnote. P.S. Pallas was a prominent pioneer explorer of the Siberian taiga. There is a whole host of historical phenomena directly or indirectly linked to the Siberian cedar. Here is one of them. In 1907, a 50-year-old semi-literate peasant named Gregory Rasputin hailed from an isolated Siberian village in an area where the Siberian cedar grows, and found himself in St. Petersburg, the capital, and soon became a regular guest of the imperial family. Not only did he amaze them with his predictions, but he possessed incredible sexual stamina. At the time of his assassination, onlookers were struck by the fact that despite his bullet-ridden body, he continued to live. Perhaps because he had been raised on cedar nuts in a part of the country where cedars abound? This is how a contemporary journalist described his staying power. At age 50, he could begin an orgy at noon and go on carousing until 4 o'clock in the morning. From his fornication and drunkenness, he would go directly to church for morning prayers. Go directly to morning prayers, praying until 8, before heading home for a cup of tea. Then, as if nothing happened, he would carry on receiving visitors until 2 in the afternoon. Next, he would accompany a group of ladies to the baths, and from the baths he would be off to a restaurant in the country, where he would begin repeating the previous night's activities. No normal person could ever keep up a regime like that. The many-time world champion and Olympic champion wrestler Alexander Karelin, who has never been defeated so far, is also a Siberian, from the area where the Siberian cedar grows. This strong man also eats cedar nuts. We're talking about pine nuts here. A coincidence? I mention only those facts which can be easily verified in popular science literature, or which can be confirmed by witnesses. Lydia Petrovna, who was given the ringing cedar pendant by the old Siberian oldster, is now one of those witnesses. She is 36 years old, married with 2 children. Her co-workers have noticed changes in her behavior. She has become kinder and smiles more often. Her husband, whom I happen to know, told me that their family has now been experiencing a greater degree of mutual understanding. He also remarked that his wife has become somehow younger looking and is starting to arouse greater feelings in him, more respect, and quite possibly more love. But all these multitudinous facts and evidences pale in comparison to the main point, which you can look up for yourself, a discovery which has left me with not a trace of doubt, and that is the Bible. In the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament, chapter 14, verse 4, God teaches us how to treat people and even decontaminate their houses with the help of the cedar. After comparing all the facts and data I had gleaned from various sources, I was confronted by such a remarkable picture that all the miracles known to the world faded before it. The great mysteries that have excited people's minds began to pale into insignificance in comparison with the mystery of the ringing cedars. Now I could no longer have any doubts about its existence. They were all dispelled by the popular science literature and the old Vedic scriptures I was reading. Cedars are mentioned 42 times in the Bible, all in the Old Testament. When Moses presented humanity with the 10 Commandments on stone tablets, he probably knew more than has been recorded in the Old Testament. We are accustomed to the fact that in nature there are various plants capable of treating human ills. The healing properties of the cedar have been attested in popular science literature by such serious and authoritative researchers as academician Pallas, and this is now consistent with the Old Testament scriptures. And now, pay careful attention. When the Old Testament talks about the cedar, it is just as the cedars alone. Nothing is said about other trees. And doesn't the Old Testament say that the cedar is by far the most potent medicine existing in nature? What is this, anyway, a medicine kit? And how is it to be used? And why, out of all the Siberian cedars, did these strange old fellows point to a single ringing cedar? But that's not all. Something immeasurably more mysterious lies behind the story from the Old Testament. King Solomon built a temple out of cedar wood. In return for the cedar from Lebanon, he gave another king, Hiram, 20 cities of his kingdom. Incredible. Giving away 20 cities just for some kind of building materials? True, he got something else in return. At King Solomon's request, he was given servants that were, quote, skilled in felling timber. What kind of people were these? What knowledge did they possess? Footnote says, in the Authorized King James Version of the Bible, this word cedar or cedars appears 75 times. And it says there are, of course, separate references to the Bible of a number of trees, i.e. fir, oak, juniper, but not in conjunction with cedar. I have heard that even now, in the far-flung reaches of the taiga, there are old people whose job it is to choose trees for construction. But back then, over 2,000 years ago, everybody might have known this. Nevertheless, specialists of some sort were required. The temple was built. Services began to be held there, and the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud. What kind of cloud was that? How and from where did it enter the temple? What could it have been? Energy? A spirit? What kind of phenomenon, and what connection did it have with the cedar? The old fellows talked about the ringing cedar as storing up some kind of energy. Which cedars are stronger, the ones in Lebanon or Siberia? Academician Pallas said the healing properties of the cedars increased in proportion to their proximity to the forest tundra. In this case, the Siberian cedar would be the stronger. It says in the Bible, "By their fruits ye shall know them." In other words, again, the Siberian cedar. Could it be that no one has paid any attention to all of this? Has no one put two and two together? The Old Testament, the science of the past century, and the current one, all of which are the same opinion regarding the cedar. And Elena Ivanova Roerich notes in her book Living Ethics, a chalice of cedar resin figured in the rituals of consecration of the ancient kings of Khorasan. Druids also call the chalice of cedar resin the chalice of life. And only later, the loss of the realization of the spirit, was it replaced by blood. The fire of Zoroaster was the result of burning the cedar resin in the chalice. So then, how much of our forebears' knowledge of the cedar, its properties and uses, has been passed down to the present day? Is it possible that nothing has been preserved? What do the Siberian oldsters know about it? And all at once, my memory harked back to an experience of many years ago, which caused a shiver to run up and down my spine. I didn't pay any attention to it back then, but now. During the early years of Perestroika, I was the president of the Association of Siberian Entrepreneurs. One day I got a call from the Novosibirsk District Executive Council. Back then we still had Communist Party committees with executive councils, asking me to come to a meeting with a prominent Western businessman. He had a letter of recommendation for the government of the day. Several entrepreneurs were present, along with workers from the Executive Council Secretariat. The Western businessman was of a rather imposing external appearance, an unusual person with Oriental features. He was wearing a turban, and his fingers were adorned with precious rings. The discussion, as usual, centered around possibilities for cooperation in various fields. The visitor said, among other things, "We would like to buy cedar nuts from you." As he spoke these words, his face and body tightened, and his sharp eyes moved from side to side, no doubt studying the reaction of the entrepreneurs present. I remember the incident very well, as even then I wondered why his appearance had changed like that. After the official meeting, the Moscow interpreter accompanying me came up to me. She said he would like to speak with me. The businessman made a confidential proposal. If I could arrange delivery of cedar nuts for him, and they had to be fresh, then I would receive a handsome personal percentage over and above the official price. The nuts were to be shipped to Turkey for processing into some kind of oil. I said I would think it over. I decided I would find out for myself what kind of oil he was talking about, and I did. On the London market, which sets standards for world prices, cedar nut oil fetches anywhere up to $500 per kilogram. Their proposed deal would have given us approximately $2 to $3 for 1 kilogram of cedar nuts. I rang up an entrepreneur I happened to know in Warsaw and asked him whether it might be possible to market such a product directly to the consumer, and whether we could learn the technology involved in its extraction. A month later, he sent me a reply. No way, we weren't able to gain access to the technology. And besides, there are certain Western powers so involved in these issues of yours that it would be better to just forget about it. After that, I turned to my good friend Konstantin Rakionov, a scholar with our Novosibirsk Consumer Cooperative Institute. I bought a shipment of nuts and financed a study, and the laboratories of his institute produced approximately 100 kilograms of cedar nut oil. I also hired researchers who came up with the following information from archival documents. Before the revolution, and even for some time afterward, there was in Siberia an organization known as the Siberian Cooperator. People from this organization traded in oil, including cedar nut oil. They had rather swanky branch offices in Harborne, London, and New York, and rather large Western bank accounts. After the revolution, the organization eventually collapsed, and many of its members went abroad. A member of the Bolshevist government, Leonid Krazin, met with the head of this organization and asked him to return to Russia. But the head of the Siberian Cooperator replied that he would be of more help in Russia if he remained outside its borders. From archival materials, I further learned that cedar oil was made using only wooden, presses in many villages of the Siberian taiga. The quality of the cedar oil depended on the season in which the nuts were gathered and how they were processed. But I was unable to determine, either from the archives or the institute, exactly which season was being indicated. The secret had been lost. There are no healing remedies with properties analogous to cedar oil. But perhaps the secret of making this oil had been passed along by one of the immigrants to someone in the West. How was it possible that the cedar nuts with the most effective healing properties grow in Siberia, and yet the facility for producing the oil is located in Turkey? After all, Turkey has no cedars like those found in Siberia. And just what Western powers was the Warsaw entrepreneur talking about? Why did he say it would be just better to forget this issue? Might not these powers be smuggling this product with its extraordinary healing properties out of our Siberian Russia taija? Why, with such a treasure here at home and such effective properties, a treasure known for centuries, for millennia even, do we spend millions and maybe billions of dollars trying to buy up foreign medicines and swallow them like half-crazed people? How is it that we have lost the knowledge known to our forebears? Our recent forebears yet, ones who lived in our century. And what about the Bible's description of that extraordinary happening of over 2,000 years ago? What kind of unknown powers are trying so earnestly to erase our forebears' knowledge from our own memories? Oh, you better stick to minding your own business, we're told. Yes, they are trying to wipe it out, and indeed they are succeeding. I was seized by a fit of anger. I checked, and yes, cedar oil is sold in our pharmacies, but it is sold in foreign packaging. I bought a single 30-gram vial and tried it. The actual oil content, I think, was no more than a couple drops. The rest was some kind of diluting agent. Compared to what was produced in the Consumer Cooperative Institute, well, there was simply no comparison. And these diluted couple of drops cost 50,000 rubles. So what if we didn't buy it abroad, but sold it ourselves? Just the sale of this oil would be enough to raise the whole of Siberia above the poverty level. But how did we ever manage to let go of the technology of our forebears? And here we are, sniveling that we live like paupers. Well, okay, I think I'll come up with something all the same. I'll produce the oil myself, and my firm will only get wealthier. I decided I would try a second expedition along the Ob. Back up north, using only my headquarters ship, the Patrice Lumumba. I loaded a variety of goods for sale into the hold and turned the film viewing room into a store. I decided to hire a new crew and not invite anyone from my firm. As things stood, my firm's financial situation had worsened while I was distracted with my new interest. 2 weeks after leaving Novosibirsk, my security guards reported they had overheard conversations about the ringing cedar. And in their opinion, the newly hired workers included some, quote, pretty strange people, to put it mildly. I began summoning individual crew members to my quarters to talk about the forthcoming trek into the taija. Some of them agreed to go on a volunteer basis. Others asked for extra pay for this operation, since it was not something they had agreed to when signing up for work. It was one thing to stay in the comfortable conditions aboard ship, quite another to trek 25 kilometers into the taija, carrying back loads of wood. My finances at the time were already pretty tight. I had not planned on selling the cedar. After all, the oldsters had said it should be given away. Besides, my main interest was not the cedar tree itself, but the secret of how to extract the oil. And of course, it would be fascinating to find out all the details connected with it. Little by little, with the help of my security guards, I realized that there would be attempts made to spy on my movements, especially after I left the ship. But for what purpose was unclear, and who was behind the would-be spies? I thought and thought about it and decided that to be absolutely certain, I would have to somehow outsmart everyone at once. So the price of the cedar oil, 50,000 rubles, equals approximately $16 US, and in 1994 that was 20% of a Russian's average monthly income.